All right, I think we can start. So today we have here Brad Neimann. Brad is an undergraduate student in his third year of Bachelor of Sciences at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Having first been exposed to phonetics and writing systems at a young age, today Brad is an enthusiastic conlanger and is interested in all areas of linguistics with a special focus on morphosyntactic alignment, which he'll be telling us about today. So Brad Neimann can share his screen and take it away.
Thank you, David. So let's see here. Working right? Everyone can see it? Excellent. So as usual, feel free to pop in with questions at any time. I mean, I'll try to answer them, or if I don't have enough time, we can ask questions at the end. We'll see how we go. And so, oops. So I'll be doing this talk in two parts. Firstly, I'll just introduce the idea of morphosyntactic alignment more generally, and I'll talk about some of the most common alignments that you find in languages and how alignment interacts with some other areas of grammar. And then next, I'll be talking about alignment splits. And these are a very interesting group of alignments. They have lots of interesting theories associated with them, but they're also very important in that nearly every language we know of has some sort of alignment split. And so we'll see how much we should get through in 30 minutes. Hopefully we should be able to get through all of it, but we'll see how we go. And so we'll start from the very basics. So someone just came in. And so these two sentences are both made up of a verb with all its core arguments. And this is about as simple as you can get in English. And so in I laugh, laugh takes only a subject in English and most other languages. And we say that laugh is an intransitive verb, whereas see takes a subject and an object, and so we call it a transitive verb. And I mean, of course, this is just very basics, but you see what this gives us is that we actually have three sorts of arguments underlined here. And so I am the intransitive subject, the subject of an intransitive verb. You here is the subject of a transitive verb, and me is the object of a transitive verb. And linguists generally actually refer to these with special names, and the standard terminology, which seems to be common nowadays, is we call the intransitive subject the sole argument, and we call the transitive subject, not an object, the agent and patient. So sole, agent, patient, agent, object, sorry, are the three sorts of arguments you get in intransitive and transitive verb, three sorts of core arguments. And what linguists usually do actually is they refer to these by the abbreviations. And so they call these arguments the S, A, and O arguments. So S is intransitive subject, A is transitive subject, and O is transitive object. And this is actually a little bit useless for English, because in English, of course, we just have subject and object, and that's perfectly sufficient. But we'll see some languages later on where this is incredibly useful, and it's useful to have a way to refer to all three arguments unambiguously. And so the problem I want to talk about today is basically, well, how do languages tell these three arguments apart? What strategies do they use to inform the listener which argument is S and which is A and which is O? And that is the problem which is solved by morphosyntactic alignment. And so let's have a look at some simple ways of solving this problem. And so the simplest solution is this one, and I'll represent it as just a circle around S and O, because in this alignment, they're all treated exactly the same. We call it neutral alignment, and in a language with neutral alignment, there is no difference between subject and object. The S and the A and the O are all treated exactly the same in grammar. And this is actually extremely rare for such a simple solution, but you can find it, for instance, in the Sino-Tibetan language Lisu. And so here is a very simple Lisu sentence from Hope's grammar. And in this sentence, you have a subject and an object, except that the words aren't really appropriate for Lisu because you just have two arguments. And Lisu has neutral alignment in sentences like this. So the subjects and objects are treated exactly the same. And so in English translation, you can translate this as tigers bite dogs, or you can translate it as dogs bite tigers. There is no difference between subject and object in Lisu. And of course, now we see why neutral alignment is so rare, because it's ambiguous. Generally speaking, languages don't like it if you don't know who's biting whom. I mean, sometimes you can work it out from what the speaker's saying, but sometimes you can't. And so let's have a look at more interesting ways of disambiguating these arguments. And so the obvious solution is, well, instead of treating them all the same, just treat them all separately. You have three sorts of marking. And in this system, you have one sort of marking for intransitive subjects, one sort of marking for agents, and one sort of marking for objects. And because there's three types of marking, we call this tripartite alignment. And tripartite alignment is also rather rare, but you can see it, for instance, in the Nez Perce language of the Pacific Northwest of the US. And so in these two sentences from Rude's grammar, again, simple transitive sentence, simple intransitive sentence, simple transitive sentence. And let's have a look at the markings on the arguments. So in this one, man, hama, is just the base form of the word. No overt suffix is added. In this one, the husband took the woman away, so the husband is agent. Hamapim, that the noun gets this ergative case marker im. And in this one, woman, ayatona, the woman gets accusative case marker na. And so I see we have three sorts of marking. We have no explicit affix, we have im, and we have na. And those correspond quite neatly to sole argument, agent, and patient. But this also has a problem. And the problem with tripartite alignment is that it actually over-distinguishes. The problem is that if you see an intransitive verb and only has one argument, and in this case it also has one agreement affix as well, which helps. If you see a verb with only one argument and that verb is an intransitive verb, well, I mean, then you know the only possible thing for, you know that it's only possible that this noun, this argument, it has to be S. It can't be L or, because that requires a transitive verb. And so you actually don't need to disambiguate quite so rigorously S from A and O. You only actually need two types of marking for perfect disambiguation of all these arguments. And so what most languages do is they actually merge S with another argument in terms of marking. And so the most common pattern is this one. We say that S aligns with A because in this system, intransitive and transitive subjects are treated exactly the same. There is no difference in their marking. Whereas there's another type of marking, which is specifically reserved for transitive objects. And this, of course, is the nominative-accusative alignment, which I'm sure we've all heard of before. And so we call this grouping of intransitive and transitive subject together the nominative argument. And we call this object argument separately. We say it gets accusative marking. And this is, of course, the system which is used in English and a lot of other languages. Any language which just has an opposition between subject and object has nominative-accusative alignment, or just accusative alignment for short, I say. And so, of course, English has it, and you can see that in the word order here. In word order, S and A are before the verb and O is afterwards. You can also see it in Latin with case marking. And so, Dominus venit, the master comes, the master takes the nominative case. But in domino servum audit, here the master also takes the nominative case, even though it's now in a transitive sentence, because S and A are treated the same. Whereas servum now takes the accusative because it's a transitive object. And you can actually see it in word ordering as well, because the verb agrees with the S argument, or it agrees with the A argument, but it doesn't agree with the O argument. It's a grouping of S and A again to the exclusion of O. And this is, of course, just the system we're all familiar with. But I mean, if you think about it, there's no real reason why you can't have the opposite system. And let's just think about what a system would mean for a moment. And in a language with a system like this, you could not talk about subjects anymore, because you have one sort of marking for the transitive subject, but you have a completely different sort of marking for intransitive subjects and objects. And this means that because intransitive and transitive subjects are different, you can't talk about subjects anymore as a unified category. Instead, you can only, but what also happens, I suppose, is that now you have this new category of objects and intransitive subjects which are treated the same. And we call this an ergative-absolutive alignment, because the intransitive subject aligns with the object in a single absolutive category, we call it, whereas the agent on its own gets ergative marking separate from this. And ergative alignment is more rare than accusative alignment, but you can find, for instance, in Jirbal. So Jirbal is a Australian Aboriginal language of northeastern Queensland. A lot of Australian languages are ergative. They have an ergative alignment. And Jirbal is actually one of the first Australian languages to have a proper description of its morphosyntactic alignment by Dixon. And that's really what started research into ergativity in the modern days. And so let's have a look at the ergative system of Jirbal. And so in this sentence, Painguma Banaganu, father returned. And in this sentence, father is in the absolutive case, which of course is just the base form of the noun. Usually absolutive case is the base form of the noun. We'll talk about this later more. But in this sentence, Palan Yabu Bangul Ngumanguburan, father saw mother. And in this sentence, well, in English, the fathers are treated the same. They're both behind the verb, whereas mother is in word order different because it's after the verb. But in Jirbal, the case marking is actually opposite. Over here, father has completely different marking between the two sentences, because here, father is the subject of an intransitive verb, so it gets absolutive marking. But the absolutive argument is the object, it's the mother, Balanyabu. And so here, mother gets absolutive argument. So you have a grouping of the intransitive subject and the transitive object, whereas the transitive subject now gets a different sort of marking. It gets ergative marking. And you can have agreement markers, of course. It's not just in case markers. I mean, I've given an example of ergative alignment in case markers, but there's other areas as well. And Donahue calls these primary morphosyntactic coding devices, which is a horribly complicated term for what's just a really simple concept. It's basically just the strategies which get used in every sentence in every language for specifying which arguments get which grammatical relations. And we've already seen ergativity in case marking, but you can also get ergativity in agreement and ergativity in word order. And so an example of ergative agreement is seen in the Mayan language Tutuhil. Actually, in all Mayan languages, almost all of them have ergative agreement. And so these English sentences, I slept and they hit me, these don't look particularly similar in any way, not in any obvious way. But the corresponding Tutuhil sentences, Shinwari and Shinkeche, And you see both of them start with this agreement affix in. And in, of course, is a first person singular absolutive agreement prefix, which means it's used for the intransitive subject, but also for the transitive subject. Intransitive I and transitive me are the same category in Tutuhil, whereas they, which is the transitive agent, is treated differently. It gets this ergative agreement marker care. And if this first sentence was they slept, I mean, you might be tempted to think that they slept and they hit me would have similar marking, but in fact, they're completely different. You could not say shkeche. That would be completely ungrammatical. It would be meaningless. If you wanted to translate they slept in Turuhil, you have to find the third person plural absolutive agreement prefix and place it over here, which would look totally different to this ergative prefix care. And an example of a language with ergative word order is actually somewhat tricky to find. There's not that many languages with ergativity and word order, but one straightforward example is the South American language Pomeri. And so let's have a look at intransitive sentences. Mother is washing, and the word order is pretty simple: wash the mother. And you might conclude, well, Pomeri maybe has verb, subject, object, word order or something. But in fact, it doesn't, because when you look at transitive sentences, suddenly this first argument moves before the verb. And all we can conclude is, well, look, it looks like the intransitive subject and the object are unified with respect to word order. They're both after the verb, whereas the transitive subject is before the verb. And so we conclude that Pomeri has ergative word order. And actually, for a language like Pomeri, the simple subject, verb, object, word order or description like that actually isn't adequate anymore, because there's no such thing as subject anymore. And instead, we have to use this this notation and say that Pomeri has verb intransitive subject / agent verb object word order. So you have to specify it separately for transitive and intransitive sentences, since S is the same as O in word order. And there's some interesting restrictions on these sorts of marking. And so one restriction is that ergative word order requires morphological ergativity. It's impossible to have ergative word order without either ergative case marking or ergative agreement that we know of. Or I should say that I know of. Maybe there's a case I don't. And so you can see indeed in Pomeri, it has an ergative case marker, so that works out well. The other restriction, and this is a far more significant one because there's not that many languages with ergative word order in the first place. The other restriction is that ergative agreement cannot occur with accusative case marking. If you have a language which has verbal agreement and nominal case marking, if your case marking is accusative, your agreement has to be accusative as well, but you can't have this combination. There's a handful of exceptions, maybe 3 or 4. They're all like a bit iffy, I suppose, in terms of how you analyze them. And so that means that for the vast majority of languages, this holds. I mean, oddly enough, the opposite is fine. You can have accusative agreement with ergative case marking. And for instance, the Australian language Warpiri has exactly this combination, but you can't have ergative agreement with accusative case marking. And so now let's digress to another topic for a moment, which is very important in alignment splits. And so let's think about this example. I punch it. You might think this is about as simple as it can get. But I mean, there's an interesting question you can ask. Why is it, well, I'm doing the punching and it's being punched, but why isn't it reversed? Why is it not the case that the thing which is being punched is the agent, whereas the thing which is doing the punching is the object? Why are the assignments of semantics to grammatical roles as it is here? And the answer is that there's actually a set of common semantics associated with agents and objects across all languages. And so we say that if a noun controls the action, it's more agentive. Whereas if a noun is affected by an action is more patientive. That's the terminology we use. Sometimes you'll see volitional, animate or stuff here, but I use agentive. And so the interesting thing is that agentive nouns are prototypically placed in agent position. Prototypical patients are placed in object position. Actually, that's where you get the terminology, agent, agentive. And this is a really useful thing to keep in mind, especially when you think about it in terms of alignment. And so accusative, what this means that accused is that alignment is basically making a statement about how agentive the intransitive subject is. And so in accusative alignment, you're basically grouping the intransitive subject with the transitive subject. So basically making a statement that the intransitive subject is agentive. Whereas in ergative alignment, you're grouping S with the O argument. You're grouping the intransitive subject with the object. So that's, and I'm sorry, this is a typo in my slides. I'm very sorry. That should be patientive, because if you're grouping the intransitive subject with the object, and objects are prototypically patientive, they're affected by the action, that means your intransitive subject, you might basically making a statement that, all right, this is grouped with the less agentive nouns, the more affected nouns by default. And the interesting thing about this is that neither of these is entirely true. And so if you, intransitive subjects actually cover a really wide range of semantic roles. I mean, it makes sense if you think about it, because intransitive verbs are just verbs with one argument. That's their own defining property. Other than that, they can do anything. So like if you think about I run, well, I'm usually in control of my own running. So in I run, the argument I is more agentive. Whereas in it breaks, like if something breaks, usually there's something breaking it. The thing that is being broken is just affected by the action. It's not usually controlling its own breaking. So in it breaks, it is more patientive, it's less agentive. And so that means that depending on the verb and the exact sentence, sole arguments of intransitive verbs can be more agentive or more patientive. So, I mean, you might think, well, this suggests that maybe you can combine the two to have some sort of composite alignment where the intransitive subject is sometimes more agentive and sometimes more patientive. Sometimes it's grouped with the agent and sometimes it's grouped with the object. And in fact, this is exactly what the vast majority of languages around the world do, and it's called a split alignment. And so let's have a look at some different sorts of split alignments. Probably the simplest one to understand is called active-stative alignment. And in active-stative alignment, you have two sorts of marking. You have one sort of marking, which I'll call nominative, and another which I'll call absolutive. The terminology is a bit controversial, I suppose. Different papers will use different terms, and I've sort of unified them to nominative absolutive. And so nominative marking, all agents get nominative marking, and similarly all objects get absolutive marking. But then the sole argument of an intransitive verb can get either type of marking depending on whether it's more agentive or patientive, depending on semantics. And we can distinguish two subtypes of active-stative alignment. The one alignment is called fluid S. And in fluid S alignment, basically it's just as simple as I said. Any S argument can get nominative or absolutive alignment, marking, and it actually changes the semantics of the sentence. And so I've given an example from the Caucasian language Tovatosh. And so in this sentence, asvuijnas, I fell down. And you can see I've given myself nominative marking. I've grouped myself with the agent. And that implies that I am in control somehow, of my falling down. I fell down on purpose. Whereas in this, you can have the same sentence, sovojense, which means, it also means I fell down. But here, the sole argument has been given absolutive alignment. I've grouped it with the object, which as we know now, the object is affected by the action. So I'm basically saying, well, in this sentence, I fell down and I was affected by the action. I fell down by accident. And so just by changing the marking of the sole argument, you get to change the meaning of the sentence, whether I did it on purpose or by accident, whether I was in control or not in control, whether it's nominative or absolutive. The other subtype is split S marking, and split S marking is a little bit more complicated. In a split S alignment, intransitive verbs are divided into two subclasses of verbs. You have active intransitive verbs, which represent actions, and stative intransitive verbs, which represent states. And this is actually language specific. It's up to each individual language which words are active and which words are stative. And so the rule in a split S language is that active verbs get nominative marking, but stative verbs get absolutive marking. And this is true no matter what in real life the argument is doing. So Guarani is the national language of Paraguay. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. And Guarani is an example of a language with split S alignment. And so in Guarani, ma'apo, work, is an active verb. So it always gets nominative marking, grema'apo. And it always gets nominative marking, even if, for instance, I happen to be doing this accidentally. And it's hard to imagine how I could be doing this accidentally, honestly. But even if I were, it would still get nominative marking because the marking is dependent on the verb, not the semantics. And similarly, nderesarai, you forgot. Esarai is a stative verb in Guarani. And so it always gets absolute marking. And so that's active-stative covered by subtypes. Now let's have a look at different types of split alignment. But this type of split alignment is a little bit more complicated. So I'll need to cover some preliminary stuff first. And so markedness is generally a very important concept in alignment. And so what is markedness exactly, we can ask. And there's actually two different ways the word is used. And so we can talk about formal markedness or functional markedness. And so formal markedness is purely a matter of phonology. Something is formally marked if it has more phonological content. And so in English, the progressive aspect is ing, whereas the simple aspect is just the base form of the word. So we say that the progressive is more formally marked than the simple in English. Whereas functional markedness is just about frequency. It's about how often a word or construction is used. And so again, in English, most English sentences have subject, verb, object, word order, but there's a handful where the object is fronted to give object, subject, verb, word order. And this is by far the less usual argument in English, and it's only ever used for the specific purpose of highlighting the object. So we say this is more functionally marked than this. And what's interesting about this is that the two types of markedness very often go together. Usually, the affix with the most phonological content is also functionally marked. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And so, as I said, markedness is very important in alignment. And the general idea, the general principle is that the intransitive subject is the least marked argument, both formally and functionally. And I mean, this makes sense, right? The intransitive subject is really distinguished by being the only argument of an intransitive verb. You can identify it even without additional marking. There's no need to mark it anymore. You don't need to disambiguate it from anything. And this has some really important consequences for case marking in alignment. And actually agreement as well, but case marking is the main one. And so it means that in a nominative-accusative system, the nominative is unmarked with respect to case marking, whereas the accusative will be more marked. And what that means is that the nominative will typically get no overt marking, whereas the accusative will be an explicit suffix or prefix or mutation or whatever. Whereas in an ergative system, this is actually completely opposite. The agent, the transitive subject, is now the marked category, whereas the intransitive subject and transitive object together are less marked. And this, you see the marking of the A and O then is reversed in ergative systems compared to what you might be used to from accusative systems. And this can have some counterintuitive consequences. For instance, in accusative systems, when you have one agreement affix on a verb, it usually agrees with the subject, which is the unmarked category. But in an ergative-absolutive system, if you have a language with only one agreement affix on the verb, like Hindi or Urdu, in those languages, it's the absolutive category which is marked. The intransitive subject and the transitive object get the agreement affix. Another counterintuitive phenomenon which can happen in ergative systems is then the anti-passive. And so I'm sure we're all familiar with how accusative systems have a passive voice, and this construction promotes the object to subject. It promotes the accusative to intransitive in the nominative. And so I saw you, agent object, turns into you were seen. You is now the sole argument of the intransitive verb were seen, and you was previously in the accusative, and it's now moved up to nominative. In an ergative system, you have the opposite. You have a voice or a construction of some sort which promotes the ergative to absolutive, and that's called an anti-passive. And so this is an example from the Chukchi language of Siberia. I announced. We're not saying what I announced. I'm just saying I announced. And this is because the anti-passive is used. Without the anti-passive, you'd have I announced something, agent and object. The anti-passive removes the object and promotes agent to subject. Remember, agent and subject are different categories, totally different categories in an ergative system. So it promotes agent to subject to give an intransitive argument, discarding the object. And so another thing which we can notice in alignment is that some nouns are more likely to be used as agents and some nouns are more likely to be used as patients. And we can actually arrange this in a hierarchy. This is called the animacy hierarchy. And it was first discovered when in field work on Algonquian languages, which use it extensively in their alignment system, which is a special alignment system I unfortunately won't be able to talk about today. But it's a very general principle. And basically what it's saying is that, well, nouns such like I and you and he and she and humans and proper nouns and so on are most likely to be in control of an action. Humans tend to be controlling of an action. Whereas the less animate nouns on the right side of this hierarchy are least likely to be in control of the action. If I'm more likely to be doing something to an inanimate or to a non-human animate, they're more likely to be affected. They're more patientive. And so what this means is that if we put our markedness hat on and start thinking in terms of markedness, it's most usual for animate nouns to be in control of the action. It's very unusual to have an animate noun in a sentence which is not controlling the action. So they are least marked in agent position, most marked in object position. And of course, the system where the object is marked is an accusative system. Whereas these nouns on the right side of the hierarchy, they're mostly in object position. They're affected. It's unusual to have them controlling an action in agent position. And so they are more marked when used as agent, which of course translates to an ergative system. And I will just quickly note that this animacy hierarchy, the exact form of it is language specific. And we know this because these markedness restrictions give an alignment split between nouns. And in an animacy-based alignment split, nouns on the left side in the hierarchy get an accusative alignment. Nouns on the right side get an ergative alignment. And the exact boundary point is determined by the language-specific animacy hierarchy. And so a good example is Jirbal. And I know I did introduce Jirbal before as an example of a straightforward ergative language, but it's not actually just that straightforward because first and second person pronouns actually have an accusative alignment, like in English. And so in Jirbal, first person and second person have the object when they occur in object position, they get this case marker na, and S and A are unmarked. But over on the right side of the hierarchy, third person pronouns and nouns have the agent marked, ngu, and the S and O, when they're using S and O positions, they take this null case marker. And so we can see that this naturally gives accusative alignment for first person and second person, and ergative alignment for third person and nouns. And this actually works really well because, as I said, in spontaneous speech, these nouns are most likely to be used in agent position, whereas these nouns are most likely to be used in object position. So those ones in agent, those ones in object, it's all unmarked. In spontaneous speech, most of the nouns will be unmarked. That works well. And actually, the corollary of this is that when they occur in unusual positions, nouns get explicit marking. And so that also works really well. Let's have a look at a more complicated split, because most languages aren't as simple as Yoruba. And so in the South American language Kashinawa, the leftmost three elements of the animacy hierarchy have object marked. 1, 2, and 3 have this marker A when they're using object position. Whereas on the right-hand side of the hierarchy, third person pronouns and nouns get nasalization in agent position. And so this very naturally gives an accusative alignment for first and second person pronouns, an ergative alignment where ergative is marked by nasalization for nouns. But in the middle, there's actually some overlap between the two alignments. And if you see the subject, the sole argument in that case has no marking. The agent is marked by nasalization, but the object is also marked by this case mark. And so that actually gives tripartite alignment for third person pronouns. And this is actually somewhat common in animacy-based systems. And I've been talking about really exotic languages for a while, depending on what your definition of exotic is. But you can also apply this analysis even to English. And so in English, for the leftmost three elements of the hierarchy, you have accusative alignment. But for the right-hand side of the hierarchy, I mean, English isn't ergative. It doesn't have any ergativity in it, not in its morphology. So those just get neutral alignment. And you can see that here, the leftmost elements have A and O marked, A and S marked the same and O marked differently. I and me, she and her. But on the right-hand side, we just have one form. There's no case marking distinction for words like ish and dog. And I'll note that this analysis I've been giving only really works for singular nouns. Plural nouns in a lot of languages, including English, are slightly more complicated. You can extend it to plural nouns, of course, but I won't have time to talk about that in this presentation. And so, nearly done. The last type of alignments that I want to talk about today is a split on tense and aspect. And the rule here is that if you have a sentence in the past tense or perfective aspect, it gets ergative case marking. But if you have a sentence in the non-past tense or an imperfective aspect, that gives accusative marking. And I mean, we could try to find a markedness-based explanation for this, semantics, like we have been doing for the other ones. And I've seen a bunch of attempts at this, but they're not really successful. I haven't yet seen any truly convincing explanation for why this particular pattern happens and not the reverse. For now, we'll just have to accept that it's a particularly common pattern, and that's how it is. We can't look for an explanation. There's not really any point. Unfortunately, a lot of linguistics is like that. And so an example of this is in the Hindustani language. And so in this sentence, and again, I hope I don't mangle it too much, Nadia Yasin ko milegi, Nadia will meet Yasin. Well, will meet is a non-past tense. And so you see here, it gets nominative-accusative alignment. The agent is left unmarked, and the unmarked case is, of course, both a nominative and an absolutive at the same time. So I just write them with a pipe between them, vertical line. Yasin is in the accusative, it's the object, and it's marked because this is a nominative-accusative alignment. Whereas in Ram has driven a car, Ram ne gari chalayi hai. Well, Ram, well, has driven is, of course, a perfective and a past, if you think about it. So Ram is in the ergative case, which is marked, and the car is in the absolutive case, which is unmarked. And so that's the end of what I have to cover today. And I'll just note briefly that there's lots we haven't covered. We haven't talked about any more unusual alignments. We haven't talked about diverse alignment, direct inverse alignment, or Austronesian alignment, or transitive alignment. They're very interesting, but unfortunately, there's only so much you can fit into 30 minutes. We haven't talked about some sort of splits. We haven't talked about splits on mood and sentence type, which are rather rare, but again, quite interesting. We haven't talked about split and transitivity. And actually, split and transitivity is interesting because there's a lot of languages which are commonly talked about as ergative. So like you often hear people say things like, well, Basque is ergative. And they're not actually wrong, but it's more correct to say these languages are split in transitive. And it can be very difficult to tell the difference. So that's an interesting thing to go into. Syntactic ergativity is a huge subject. It's about ergative phenomena in syntax. And again, interesting, again, huge topic, and I don't have time to go into it. And I also haven't talked about how ergative and accusative systems evolve into each other. And if you want to know more, here's some resources you can look through. And the best one is certainly R.M.W. Dixon's book, just called Ergativity. I mean, I've written here, it's the Ergativity Bible. I mean, it's a little bit out of date, but it has basically everything you might want to know about ergativity. It's just so incredibly useful. Also good is McGregor's article on the typology of ergativity. It's basically a summary of Dixon, but it has some interesting stuff of its own. It talks about differential marking, differential subject marking, and differential object marking, which is interesting. Of course, contributing to the tradition, I also wrote my own guide about a year or two ago. You can read in here. I wrote it when I was I didn't know quite so much about ergativity, but I still think on the whole, it's pretty good. And of course, I encourage you to read my own guide. I wouldn't miss a chance for advertisements. And for other topics, Scott Delancey has an interesting alternate view of ergativity. It's his opinion that ergativity doesn't exist, and his arguments are pretty interesting. I tend to actually agree with him in some ways. And he has an interesting overview of ergativity in Tibetan, which is really different to the type of ergativity I've been talking about here. And if you want to know about intransitive alignment and semantic alignment, Donahue and Wichman's book is really, really good. And so that's it. Thank you everyone for listening. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, so if you guys have questions, well, first of all, thanks, Brad, for the great talk. And so, yeah, if you guys have any questions, put them into the chat or just say them out loud. And we'll wait a little for people to be able to type stuff into the chat.
Yeah.
Also, while you're doing that, I will link in the chat the LingLeague Discord, which is a place where you can ask Brad and more questions, and also where you can join the community of teens interested in linguistics like you on Discord.
And I'll stop the share now, I think. No questions? All right then. It doesn't look like we're getting anything in the chat or in speech. So I'm not sure there's anything anyone is curious about.
And yeah, but again, if you have more questions, join the Discord and you can ask Brad there too. Oh, okay. So typing.
We have something?
Oh, wait.
Yeah. Lots of interesting people. No questions. Well, thank you. Let's just wait for Giuseppe to finish type. In Italian, the marking of some verbs declares the subject, but in some verbs, the marking means the object. Would this be counted as ergativity, or what else is it? Now, That's actually really interesting. I've never heard of this system in Italian, and this is actually a really interesting system. My intuition is that it would be some sort of active-stative or split-intransitive system, but there's lots of different alignments and lots of little differences between them. It seems it's a Spanish oblique marking on certain experience of verbs. Well, yes, it could be that as well. That's another system. Given that it's a Romance language, I'd say it probably is more like oblique marking, which is an interesting alignment system, but I haven't really looked into it personally. I don't know very much about it. But I mean, I think actually it's interesting that you say that. So I'll screenshot your comment, Giuseppe. Thank you for it. And I'll have a look in my own time. And if you join the Discord, I can try to get back to you.
I guess I have a question from that. I asked him in the chat, but Giuseppe said when he used his example for the possibly ergative system, I guess, where he said it would be io piaccio, which that interests me because like in Spanish, like Jonathan said, it would be like me would be the pronoun. It wouldn't be like yo gusta. So I think, Brad, would you say like that? How would you analyze that?
Right.
Like,
so,
that make a difference?
let me think. Here we're starting to see the problem with trying to, and hold on, I'll get your question in a moment. Locity 64. So mi piaccio would be I like myself. And so actually, I honestly, at this point, I admit I don't know. Alignment systems can get really complicated. There's lots of subtleties, and I don't quite feel comfortable and analyzing something conclusively with only a couple of sentences worth of data. So I'm sorry, I'll have to get back to you later on. Thank you. Right, next question. Do we know how such orderings evolve in systems? Like what makes some languages evolve accusative or ergative systems? Excellent question. And so I'll answer in two parts. Firstly, as far as we can tell, Dixon has a really interesting analysis in terms of discourse factors of why languages might be accusative or ergative. And basically what he says is that in natural speech, even without an ergative or accusative system, there's some sentences in which S groups naturally with A and some which groups more naturally with O. And what that means is that there's, I suppose, factors pushing languages in either direction, and ultimately it's language specific as to which one ends up winning, I suppose. The other question you can ask is, well, how does the orderings, how does one alignment system evolve into another? And so, as I said, I didn't cover that. You'll have to read Dixon's book for that. He has a good overview. But basically, the general principle is that you have a verb like take or something. I take a knife, cut bread or something. Then the subject falls off, take knife, cut bread, and that can give you take grammaticalizing into an ergative case marker. And there's lots of different verbs and other words which can grammaticalize into ergative and accusative case markers. So I have to look at a dedicated book on historical linguistics for all the details. Does culture affect our systems? Not that I know
of. And we can probably get one more question before we have to close the meeting.
Are there any lateral? Yes, excellent question. So I mentioned very briefly at the end, there's something called transitive alignment. And transitive alignment is exactly what you're saying. A and O are merged, S is not. And this alignment is found in exactly one language in the whole world, which is the Iranian language Roshani. In the past tense, it has transitive alignment. And the reason not very many languages have an alignment is because it's a bit useless. I said already that S is generally disambiguated on its own. It's the only augmentive and intransitive verb, whereas agent and object need a disambiguation. And so if you have a system which merges A and O but marks S separately, well, that's doubly useless. And actually, we can see that in some younger speakers, Roshani is already moving away from transitive alignment. It's evolving to I can't remember whether it's an accusative alignment or an ergative alignment. I think it's an accusative alignment, if I remember correctly. And so there's actually another example of one alignment evolving into another.
Awesome. So yeah, we probably have to close the meeting right now for the next one. But thank you so much, Brad. And yeah.
And thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.